and welcome back to From the Ground Up, a podcast from the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts, where we dive into the processes that turn minerals in the ground all across the world into green technology like solar panels and EV batteries. I'm Quinn Pennington, and I'm here with my friends Logan.
Hey.
Rand.
Hey, everyone.
And Christian.
Howdy.
In these first couple of episodes, we've been going through the story of a mineral, from beginning to end. In the first episode, we talked about how minerals are discovered and the preparations that occur before mining. In the second episode, we talked about mining itself, how the mineral comes out of the ground. And today, we're going to finish that story by looking at what happens to a mineral after it leaves the mine, as it slowly becomes the solar panels on your house or the batteries in your vehicle. Let's start at the beginning. We've got a heap of precious minerals in a box underground. So the first thing you're going to need to do before you can process it or manufacture it is transport it. This causes greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, most transportation associated with the mining industry is driven by fossil fuels. No pun intended. And of course, minerals are heavy, and the further you need to move them, the greater those emissions will be. All right, let's move to manufacturing. Christian, where are the minerals going?
So raw materials and minerals are headed to a refinery or a processing plant to be mended into components that will then come together to make a final consumer end product. However, this depends on the needs of the manufacturer. For instance, if it's a solar panel, they're going to require polysilicon be refined to make solar cells for solar panels. If it's a wind turbine, they're going to require thousands of components consisting of steel and fiberglass to come together to make the nacelle, the stem, base for the wind turbine.
So these refineries, is the goal to, take out impurities, like little bits of rock that are in with the metal, or are we, combining these things to create new types of chemicals, or, what's the deal?
So during the refining phase, the minerals are put through various processes depending on the geological makeup to get rid of waste, and this increases the quality or the purity of the minerals.
Okay, but, I know we need, gold and copper to build technology. It seems like in that case, maybe our goal is to make sure we have gold and copper that are relatively pure. Versus the polysilicon, is that something that you mine directly out of the ground, or is that something that is sort of created from different mineral constituents?
That's a great question. So the difference between a gold deposit that's in a vein is that it goes through a different process where you had to break down the rock, and then it goes through a leaching process to where it's oxidized so that only the gold's extracted. On the other hand, for polysilicon, it's actually refined from quartzite, which goes through a substantial chemical process that turns the quartzite to a charcoal-colored material.
That's wild. Okay, so what happens next?
After the minerals are refined, the minerals are then sent to a manufacturer once they are in their purest form, depending on the quality that the manufacturer wants. In this case, the manufacturer can twist them into the components that they need for the end product. For example, a wind turbine needs steel to be mended into sheets for the tower. For example, the blades on a wind turbine, they need steel, glass, wood, so many different layers of components that come together to make up the blades for the wind turbine. Or the bolts, nuts, gears, screws in the nacelle, which is the brain of the wind turbine, so that the wind turbine generates energy.
What is a solar panel made of?
The primary mineral in solar panels is polysilicon. As you may know, is a mineral that was typically used for electrical components, hence Silicon Valley, but is also used primarily in the development of solar panels. The reason for this is that polysilicon provides the mineral to generate electricity within the solar panel.
All right, so how do we take polysilicon and these other materials and turn it into a solar panel?
So polysilicon is used to make photovoltaic cells that generate electricity in the solar panel.
Okay, so tell me if this is right. Solar panels are made mostly of polysilicon, which is used in the photovoltaic cells to somehow turn sunlight into electricity. And this mineral is also used in other types of electronics, which is a part of why Silicon Valley was called Silicon Valley.
Yes.
Okay, so then you take this material and you kind of layer it in sheets
Right.
in creating a solar panel?
Right.
Oh, like lasagna.
Yeah. So we've got a polysilicon lasagna that reacts with sunlight to make electricity, but also making this is one of the most toxic and greenhouse gas intensive processes in clean energy, right?
Yes, the process of producing polysilicon is a highly toxic and energy intensive process that some estimates conclude produces around 500,000 tons or 91% of carbon emissions, having the largest negative impact on the environment.
Logan, I thought the point of green technology was that it was going to be better for the environment and human health. Can you talk a little bit more about these negative effects and the bigger picture there?
Yeah, you really would think. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world, and even green technology, which is supposed to be, like you said, one of the safest kinds of energy, we still see important human health impacts. Whether it's because the extraction and processing of raw materials can lead to air and water pollution, as well as like occupational hazards for the workers, the people who are actually making these solar panels or EV batteries and whatnot, we see detrimental health impacts. Furthermore, disposal is something we have to talk about here. Disposal of green tech products at the end of a product's lifespan can contribute to environmental pollution and further risk nearby communities.
What happens to the workers who are handling this toxic byproduct in solar panel facilities?
What you guys have been kind of talking about a bit is that solar panels really aren't all sunshine as everyone thinks, right? They can produce 300 times more toxic waste than a nuclear reactor, which I think is pretty crazy. Solar panel manufacturing often exposes workers to really hazardous chemicals like cadmium, silicon tetrachloride, like Christian was saying. And it leaves workers at risk of really serious problems, respiratory problems, skin irritation, and other health issues.
All right, so solar panels aren't all sunshine, but how does this stack up against coal?
Really, in comparison to coal, there is no comparison. Solar panels are still better by a lot. They're better for workers because coal involves, as we've talked about in the past few episodes, all of the mining and extraction is very deadly and dangerous. Solar panels are renewable. They can last for a really long time, for decades, and technology on it is even getting better. Coal is not renewable. We have to keep going to get more and more coal. We have to set up new mines. We have to extract them from different locations because it runs out. And then, of course, coal has this huge systemic effect on our ecosystem and on the world. Greenhouse gases that come from coal lead to acid rain. Power plants produce tons of air pollution, which, again, just like with the workers, is deadly. It's toxic and carcinogenic. And we see very serious health effects coming from that. The point is, Quinn, coal really affects everyone at the end of the day. Solar panels doesn't have that kind of systemic effect.
A lot of what you said right there is really focused on human health effects, and you mentioned that coal has all sorts of really bad systemic effects for the ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit more about the environmental picture for solar and the comparison between solar and coal?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the obvious here. In order to create a mine, you have to make space for it, right? You have to commit to sometimes massive scales of deforestation. You have to be willing to create water and air pollution through runoff and everything that comes with that. Not to mention, you have to create the roads and connections between the mines so that you can actually transport the resources, which also leads to further habitat destruction and deforestation. Mining activities, they cause soil erosion, degradation of air and water quality, and general loss of biodiversity. Again, just has such a massive impact on everywhere in the ecosystem.
And here's another thing about the comparison between coal and solar. You don't really hear about a lot of solar spills happening. And if they did, I'm sure that people would just probably get a little bit more tan.
Rand, are you ready? It's that time of the episode. Give us the view from legal.
Oh boy, this is my favorite time. So what we're talking about here, production of clean energy and renewable technology, that's a huge change. It's a top-bottom process that's eventually going to affect every aspect of our economy. And in order to make this transition in a timely way to stave off some of the worst impacts of climate change, we're going to need a lot of stuff, and we're going to need it fast. So there's a lot of increased demand for some of these crucial minerals and materials in order to meet the goals that a lot of governments and even private actors across the globe have set for reducing emissions. A 2020 report from the World Bank predicts that production of minerals used in many of these green technologies like cobalt, graphite, and lithium, the demand for that could grow by almost 500% by 2050. And they also note that we're going to need to massively scale up mineral recycling as well to help meet this demand and to quickly deploy the crucial production and storage tech we need to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. On the legal end, the Inflation Reduction Act is probably the most significant piece of climate-related legislation passed in the last year worldwide, or definitely at least in the United States. It has like an interesting framework in that it mostly uses subsidies and tax credits and other market-based incentives to incentivize private actors into stepping up their game when it comes to production of these energy technologies. It contains a lot of subsidies to companies that domestically mine these critical minerals. In fact, one executive at the consulting company Ernst & Young described it as, quote, essentially creating a new industry in the U.S. But the IRA isn't the end of the story here. The CHIPS and Science Act also contains a lot of provisions to boost domestic production of semiconductors and funding for research and development of innovative new methods for mining of these critical minerals that we've been talking about on these episodes. Now, these laws are intended to reduce the impact of supply chain disruptions on America's green transition, as well as counter the economic power of competitors for the same minerals across the globe. Now, as a side note, putting my international relations hat on, well, it's fascinating to watch this process of essentially neo-protectionism occur, because it's a retreat from the liberal internationalism that's characterized much of the post-World War II global system, a system that America, by and large, helped set up. Now, a key assumption of that project was that increased international trade, including in these minerals that we've been talking about, and sharing of technologies and such, would lower the risk of armed conflict, because interconnected nations would face large economic costs and shortages of these vital imports as a result of war. Now, thinkers in this tradition, like Francis Fukuyama of End of History fame, who used to live close by to the university, believed that capitalism and democracy were mutually reinforcing. So bringing capitalism to formerly communist nations like Russia and China would inevitably lead to democratic development in these nations. Sounds... Exactly. That assumption governed our foreign policy for decades, as well as a lot of our economic policy. And we're now seeing that these fundamental assumptions might be fundamentally flawed. So where this ties back to green tech and mining and manufacturing, John Mearsheimer in the Committee on International Relations, just down the street from where we are, he might say that great powers are taking a more realist approach to minerals extraction now. Now, these critical minerals are necessary to secure a position in a multipolar world with multiple power centers instead of just one, built on high-tech economies and militaries. And so these nations will seek to increase production within their borders and to grab as much as they can from weaker nations abroad.
Speaking of things that are scary, Christian, tell us about cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, is essential as we become more technology and digitally dependent in the mining industry. However, right now, mining is not defined or categorized as a critical industry as it pertains to the United States government and the Department of Justice.
Why does that matter, that classification? Does that get you access to money or resources or privileged legal status or what?
Critical industry is defined by the U.S. government as a vital asset or system that, if destroyed or compromised, would result in a destabilizing effect on the security of the nation. When the government identifies an industry as critical, this industry is afforded protections by Homeland Security, by the Department of Justice, etc. So the government, the federal government specifically, keeps an eye on these industries and the integrity of these industries.
And in your personal view, do you think that mining should be on that list?
I do. I think that mining must be on this list as a piece of critical infrastructure, as it is essential to the development of our technologies that we're so dependent on, whether it's for chips, whether it's for wind turbines, solar panels, EV batteries, our laptops that we do our everyday work from, etc.
What would it take to get mining on the list?
This is done through legislation. Legislators have introduced bills to identify and categorize mining as a critical industry, and industry supports this. A matter of fact, while I was in Colorado for the Society of Mining, Metallurgy, and Exploration conference, this was a key tech session that was discussed by industry of the vulnerabilities of the mining industry to hackers, whether foreign or domestic, the industry overall, and through a ripple effect, many other industries that are categorized as critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You know, you've mentioned the way that technology is dependent on mining, and elsewhere in this podcast, we've talked a lot about how green technology is really dependent on mining. So I, can only imagine in a climate future where we rely even more on green technology, how vulnerable the United States could be to some kind of major cyber attack on mines. That is really interesting. So we already know about the pros and cons of mining. What are the pros of recycling?
Honestly, recycling can give us one of our best case scenarios here. Recycling can create some kind of circular economy. We can see waste, whether it's from leftover resources from whatever's being produced or greenhouse gas emissions, all of those being reduced, and at the same time, resources are being reused. We get to use them again. We pay less money because we already have the resources. We're not digging them from the ground up. It can oftentimes be a win-win. At the same time, though, not all materials are recyclable. Recycling processes can be rather restrictive in the kind of materials that you're able to put in, or maybe you do have the right materials, but you need to refine them in some way or process them in some way before they can even be recycled, right? And additionally, I mean, recycling definitely does have environmental impacts. It does have energy consumption, which leads to emissions. It itself can have emissions.
And another one of these best case scenarios is industrial upcycling, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like what I was saying with making a circular economy, but maybe a little bit on steroids, right? Because you're taking resources from one industry and putting them into another industry, because it's not always the case that your own industry is able to reuse those resources. Maybe they are really at the end of their life for the purposes of your industry. But that doesn't mean that other industries can't use them, right? And in that way, it really does create a kind of closed loop circular system. And just like the rest of recycling, it reduces waste, it reduces pollution, because you are still finding new ways to use these resources.
So those are the pros. What are the cons?
Oh man, I didn't want to talk about this. Well, yeah, I guess it's not always grass is greener on the other side with recycling. Not all materials are recyclable, right? And in the case of industrial upcycling, you can't always industrially upcycle, right? You don't always have other industries you can send those resources to. Recycling has a lot of inputs, a lot of energy that goes into it that can lead to emissions itself. And just by the very nature of energy and consuming energy, that is indirectly producing emissions, right? So all in all, even though it's intended for reducing environmental impacts, it can also be increasing them at the same time if you're not careful. And one last point on that, it can also be cheaper to extract new materials depending on where you are, what the financial situation of your firm, your mine is, everything like that. So even though it's getting cheaper to recycle nowadays, that is always something that comes into play.
What's the worst case scenario?
Yeah, well, if we're looking at recycling as the positive side of the coin, then not recycling and just throwing out those materials, dumping, right, is really going to be the kind of worst case scenario here. There is definitely a lot of pressure towards a lot of firms to not do this. However, at the end of the day, it comes down to the bottom line, right? So sometimes it really is easier to, especially if you're extracting resources in countries that don't have such strict environmental regulations, you can dump your resources there, which definitely has implications in terms of the environment and the health of the community. Also, we see this in countries that do have stricter environmental regulations. This happens here in the United States, but going back to what I was talking about in the first episode with NIMBYs and Not in My Backyard, you see extraction happening in different neighborhoods and dumping happening particularly in communities that are the most marginalized.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the weird outcomes of this is this sort of mostly hypothetical idea right now of landfill mining, where, because it can be very challenging and very expensive to extract like tiny bits of cobalt and gold and copper out of used electronics, those things end up in landfills. And as a result, a lot of landfills have way higher concentrations of precious metals than do actual mines themselves.
Funny how that works.
Funny. I mean, unfortunately, landfills are also notoriously super toxic. Kind of, by nature, a lot of electronics contain heavy metals. You get those things into a landfill, and now you have just a batch of material that's totally inundated with heavy metals, among other contaminants. You've got your plastics that are toxic, that are breaking down. These are edge cases, but, there are cases where landfills can be radioactive. The hazards are endless. And so right now, this idea of mining landfills, or the idea that landfills are the mines of the future, is a kind of hypothetical that people kick around. But, the thought is, at some point, it might become necessary to develop the techniques to recover some of these technological minerals out of landfills as mining becomes, less available and less feasible in the future.
I think this is a good time for takeaways. Mine is actually about what you said, Quinn, regarding greater concentrations of minerals and precious metals within consumer end technologies or goods. What I am taking away from that is that there are potentially high-grade minerals and metals within those goods. However, it's not always feasible, and the carbon footprint from recycling may negate the benefits.
My takeaway is kind of also off of this. And this is a little bit far afield, but I read a lot of sci-fi, in part because I really appreciate the way that sci-fi writers think about the relationships between people and their environment. And a lot of the time, the vehicle to do that is that we're imagining this futuristic thing. But this, landfills are the mines of the future, that feels to me like it is sci-fi, not like it's something that we're actually writing think pieces about and making plans to do. Obviously, we've now left the realm of policy and we're firmly in the realm of fiction and speculation. But for me, this kind of clarifies, I expect that this might be a developing country where this is happening. I expect that this person has to wear a lot of PPE. We talked about the heavy metals and the carcinogens in landfills. I could imagine, if I were writing this character, how I would discuss their future and the health effects that will stay with them, or how I would discuss the health of people who are in their network and in their lives and families and communities. I think what I'm saying is, if you have a hookup at Netflix, send them my way. Our email is uc3pfromthegroundup@gmail.com. That's my takeaway.
Yeah, Quinn, that's an interesting point, especially about some of these technologies still seeming futuristic, even though we're trying to put them in place right now. I'm looking in the opposite direction, and at the risk of oversimplifying a little bit, and any professional historians listening, feel free to email us with any corrections, but I see some interesting parallels to what we're talking about right now and some of the mercantilist philosophies that we saw in Europe a couple hundred years ago. In that, in those days, there was an assumption that there was a finite amount of gold and silver in the world, and those were essential to a country's functioning then. So the name of the game was to go out all around the world and forcibly take as much gold and silver as you could and bring it back to your country. Nowadays, a lot of minerals that are crucial to manufacturing of green technologies are seeing increased attention from powers all across the world. And I can see a kind of race developing where countries are hoping to, if not physically cart the minerals back, then at least to secure more rights to more deposits than any other country, to guarantee that they'll be able to transition to a green economy and continue to function and project power in a post-fossil fuel world.
Yeah, I think my takeaway really goes back to a lot of what Rand said earlier. We talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been a huge boon to the environmental justice movement in the United States, but it also really doesn't go far enough. So the fact that we still have so much more climate legislation and environmental legislation that needs to happen in order to avoid global catastrophe, and what we're seeing with dumping in developing countries, as we were talking about earlier, we see a really, really unsustainable present and future. So going back to Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, that takes on some kind of good meaning that capitalism has triumphed over other ideologies and it's going to lead to more democracy and so on and so forth, which is debatable. But in the context of the environment and climate change, end of history takes on a really different and sinister meaning. So while the IRA is good, if we don't want to see an actual end of history where we see marginalized communities suffering to the point where there is no more community, we need to do more than that. We need to go further.
Yeah, heavy takeaways today. That's why we're doing this podcast. That's why we're having these conversations, is because the stakes really are so high, and there really is this intermarriage between the really nitty-gritty technical, mechanical, legal facets and then, what really are life or death stakes as we look ahead to the climate future. Looking a little bit at just the sort of structure and overview of the podcast, in these first 3 episodes, we've really tried to provide a foundation about mining minerals, the life cycle of a mineral. And we've been very heavy on providing information and telling the story from the perspective of metals and other resources. Going forward, we're going to change the format of the podcast a little bit. So we'll be doing more interviews with experts in natural resource and energy policy, as well as ESG investing and other related fields. And we're also going to do more deep dives. I know there have been a couple of places that I've earmarked where it's like, I want to learn a lot more about that. And so we'll be looking for opportunities to learn as much as we can about some of these really interesting little facets in the field. As always, thank you for joining us on From the Ground Up. If you have thoughts or questions, or if you would like to talk to us on air, drop us a line at uc3pfromthegroundup@gmail.com.